Ambassador Keth Varanes stood at the observation deck of her diplomatic vessel and watched the small blue planet grow larger through the viewport. She had seen hundreds of worlds in her 40 years of service to the Silurian collective, but Earth always made her feel something strange. Something she could not quite name. It was not fear, and it was not wonder, it was confusion. The Galactic Concord had existed for 12,000 years, and in all that time, every species followed the same pattern when discovered. First came the shock of learning they were not alone in the universe. Then came the questions and the hunger for knowledge after. That came the requests for technology and trade and military protection. Finally came integration into the great family of civilizations that spread across 1 million stars. Humanity had done none of these things. 3 centuries ago, when Concord scouts first detected radio signals from this unremarkable yellow star system, they had expected to find a primitive species still learning to harness electricity. What they found instead was something far more puzzling. Humans had already been to their moon and back. They had robots exploring their neighboring planets. They were building space stations and launching satellites and dreaming of the stars. But when the Concord arrived with offers of friendship and advanced technology and membership in the greatest alliance the galaxy had ever known, the humans had simply smiled and said, "No thank you." Keth remembered reading the reports from those early contact teams. The humans had been polite and curious and genuinely friendly. They had asked thousands of questions about alien biology and culture and history. They had shared their own art and music and stories with enthusiasm, but when offered faster than light travel, they had declined. When offered weapons that could crack planets, they had declined. When offered a seat on the Concord Council, they had declined. "We are not ready," they had said. "We need more time." The Concord had not understood then, and Kef still did not understand now. She turned from the viewport as her assistant Myra entered the observation deck. Myra was young for a Silurian, barely 200 years old, and she still believed that problems could be solved with enough effort and good intentions. "Ambassador," Myra said, "the human delegation has confirmed our landing coordinates. We will touch down at their welcome center in 3 hours." Keth nodded and felt the familiar weight of exhaustion settle over her shoulders. This was her 17th visit to Earth, and she already knew how it would go. The humans would greet her with warm smiles and genuine hospitality. They would feed her strange but delicious food and show her beautiful gardens and introduce her to artists and musicians and philosophers. They would answer her questions with patience and curiosity, and when she asked them to join the Concord and help fight the Varth Dominion, they would politely refuse. The Varth were coming. Everyone in the galaxy knew it. For the past 50 years, the Dominion had been expanding at a terrifying rate, conquering system after system and leaving nothing but death in their wake. The Concord had fought back, but they were losing. 3 weeks ago, the Varth had destroyed the homeworld of the Veshan people. 6 billion lives ended in a single afternoon, and through it, all humanity had done nothing. They sat in their single solar system, tending their gardens and raising their children and watching the stars burn with complete indifference. It made Kath angry in a way she rarely allowed herself to feel. How could they be so calm when civilizations were dying? How could they look at the suffering of billions and simply shrug? What was wrong with them? Landing was smooth and the welcome center was beautiful as always. Humans had a gift for architecture that Keth had never seen in any other species. They built structures that seemed to grow from the earth itself. All curved lines and living walls and sunlight streaming through crystal windows. A delegation of 5 humans waited for her at the entrance, led by a tall woman with silver hair and kind eyes named Director Sarah Shun. "Ambassador Varanes," Director Chung said, extending her hand in the human greeting gesture. "Welcome back to Earth. We are honored by your visit." Keth took the offered hand and felt the warmth of human skin against her own cooler flesh. Director Chen, she said, "Thank you for receiving me on such short notice. I wish I came with better news. The director's smile did not waver, but something flickered in her eyes. Understanding perhaps, or maybe pity. We have heard about the Veshan homeworld. Director Chan said, We grieve for their loss, do you? Kath asked. Before she could stop herself, the director studied her for a long moment, and then nodded slowly. We do, Ambassador. She said, More than you might believe. Please come inside and rest from your journey. We have prepared quarters for you and your staff. The quarters were comfortable, and the food was excellent, and that night Kath lay awake in a bed designed for human bodies and stared at the ceiling. Outside her window, she could hear the sounds of the city. Laughter and music and the quiet hum of electric vehicles moving through streets lined with trees. There was no fear in those sounds, no urgency, no awareness that the galaxy was burning. She rose before dawn and walked through the gardens surrounding the welcome center. Past flowers she could not name and trees that reached toward the lightening sky. Human man sat on a bench near a small pond, feeding bread to fat orange fish that swam in lazy circles. Good morning, he said without looking up. You are the alien ambassador. Yes, I am. Kath said. The man nodded and tossed another piece of bread to the fish. My grandson wants to be an astronaut, he said. He's only 7, but already he knows the names of all the moons in our system. I tell him maybe one day he will visit them. Kath sat down on the bench beside him. Do you not want more for him? She asked. Do you not want him to see the galaxy, to walk on worlds orbiting distant stars? The man finally looked at her, and his eyes were old and wise and full of something Kath could not read. I want him to be happy. The man said, I want him to know peace. I want him to grow old surrounded by people who love him. The galaxy will still be there when humanity is ready for it. But the galaxy is at war. Kath said, Species are dying. Civilizations are being erased. How can you be ready for something that might not exist when you finally decide to leave? The man smiled a sad, gentle smile and returned his attention to the fish. That is the question, is it not, Ambassador? He said, That is the question we have been asking ourselves for 300 years. He stood and brushed bread crumbs from his simple clothing. Enjoy the gardens, he said. They are quite beautiful at sunrise. Then he walked away and left Kath alone with the fish and the flowers and the terrible quiet of a species that had seen something in the stars that made them choose to stay home. The formal meetings began on the second day and went exactly as Kath had expected. She sat across from the Earth Consensus Council in a room filled with natural light and growing plants and presented her case with all the skill 40 years of diplomacy had given. The Varth Dominion had conquered 18 systems in the past year alone. The Concord fleet was stretched thin and growing. Thinner species that had existed for millions of years were being wiped from the galaxy. Forever humanity had technology the Concord did not understand and resources they had never shared. Would they not help? Would they not fight? Would they not at least care? The council listened with patience and respect. And when Kath finished speaking, they thanked her for her passion and her dedication to peace. Then they said, No, or stand your frustration, Ambassador, said Councillor James Okonkwo, a man with dark skin and white hair who spoke with a voice like warm honey. We truly do. But humanity has made its choice, and we will not change it. Why? Kath demanded. Why you hide here while the galaxy burns? What are you afraid of? The council members exchanged looks that Kath could not interpret. We are not afraid, Councillor Okonkwo said. We are patient for what? Kath asked. Patient until there is nothing left to save. Councillor Okonkwo leaned forward, and his eyes were sad but firm. Ambassador Varanis, he said, do you know what humanity was doing 300 years ago? When your ships first arrived in our system, Kath shook her head. We were killing each other. The counselor said, we had weapons that could poison the air and water and soil for generations. We had built bombs that could turn cities into ash in the blink of an eye. We had divided ourselves into tribes and nations and religions, and we hated each other with a passion that nearly destroyed us all. He paused and looked at his fellow council members. We came very close, Ambassador, he said, closer than you can imagine. We stood at the edge of extinction, and we looked into the void, and we saw ourselves reflected back. Kath felt something cold move through her chest. What happened? She asked. The counselor smiled a tired smile. We chose differently, he said. We looked at our history, and we saw the pattern. Expansion and conquest and war and death. Over and over again for 10,000 years. And we realized that the pattern would never end unless we ended it ourselves. That is why we stayed home, Ambassador. That is why we tend our gardens and raise our children and watch the stars. Not because we are afraid, but because we know what we would become if we did not after the meeting. Kath walked alone through the streets of the human city. She watched families eating meals together in outdoor cafes. She watched children playing games in parks filled with trees and flowers. She watched old people sitting on benches and feeding birds and smiling at strangers. There was no hunger here, no poverty, no violence, no fear. How had they done it? How had a species so prone to destruction found a way to build something so beautiful? She found herself standing outside a building marked with words she did not understand, and a woman appeared at the doorway and smiled at her. You look lost, Ambassador, the woman said. Kath turned and studied the woman. She was young with dark hair and curious eyes, and she wore simple clothes that suggested she worked with her hands. I am looking for answers, Kath said, and I do not know where to find them. The woman nodded as if this made perfect sense. I am Dr. Elena Vasquez, she said. I am a historian. Perhaps I can help. They sat together in Elena's small office surrounded by books and papers and artifacts from human history. Kath had never seen so many physical documents in one place, and she found herself fascinated by the texture of the paper and the smell of the ink. You study the past, Kath said. Elena nodded. I study what we were, she said, so that we can understand what we have become. The ambassador leaned forward in her chair. Tell me, she said. Tell me what happened 300 years ago. Tell me why humanity chose to stay silent. Elena was quiet for a long moment, and then she rose and walked to a shelf filled with old photographs. This is what we were, she said, holding up an image of a ruined city, broken buildings and empty streets, and smoke rising from fires that had burned for days. And this, she said, holding up another image of soldiers marching through rubble, carrying weapons designed to kill as efficiently as possible. And this, she said, showing a photograph of children with hollow eyes and thin bodies, standing in front of a fence made of wire. We were monsters, Ambassador, Elena said. We told ourselves we were civilized, but we were monsters. We killed each other over land and resources and ideas and the color of our skin. We built machines to make the killing faster and easier, and we celebrated when our enemies died. Kath stared at the images and felt her hearts beating faster. What changed? She whispered. Elena set down the photographs and returned to her seat. We broke, she said simply. We pushed ourselves to the very edge of extinction, and something inside us finally broke. Not our bodies, but our spirit, our certainty that we knew best, our belief that conquest was the natural order of things. She smiled a sad smile. When your ships arrived, Ambassador, we were still healing. We looked at your Concorde, and we saw ourselves reflected back. Species fighting for dominance, empires rising and falling. The same patterns we had nearly destroyed ourselves following, and you decided to stay out of it. Kath said. We decided to become something new, Elena said. We decided that if the pattern was inevitable, then we would remove ourselves from it. We would prove that a species could choose peace, even when the galaxy chose war. But the galaxy is dying, Kath said. Species are being exterminated while you sit here doing nothing. Elena reached across and took Kath's hand in her own. Do you know what the Vorath will become if they conquer the galaxy? She asked. Heth shook her head. They will become the next species to be conquered. Elena said, that is how it always works. The conquerors grow weak and complacent, and then someone else rises to replace them. It has happened 1,000 times in your Concord's history. It happened 1,000 times in ours. She squeezed Keth's hand gently. We cannot stop that cycle, Ambassador. No one can. All we can do is refuse to be part of it. All we can do is be ready to help when the cycle finally ends. That night, Keth received word that the Vorath had conquered 2 more Concord systems. She stood at her window and watched the human city sleep peacefully beneath a sky full of stars, and for the first time in 40 years she wondered if she had been asking the wrong questions all along. On the 5th day of her visit, Keth received an invitation she had never expected. Message came from Counselor Okonkwo himself, delivered by a young human courier who smiled and bowed and left before Keth could ask any questions. Ambassador Voranis. The message read, You have asked us many times why humanity remains silent. You have asked us what we are waiting for. You have asked us what we know that the galaxy does not. We have decided to show you. Come to the following coordinates at sunrise tomorrow. Tell no one. Bring only yourself. Keth spent the night unable to sleep in 40 years. No alien had ever been invited to see whatever the humans were hiding. She had heard rumors, of course. Everyone in the Concord had. Some said humanity had built terrible weapons that could destroy stars. Others said they had found a way to live forever still. Others said they had made contact with something ancient and powerful that had taught them secrets beyond comprehension. Keth did not know what to believe, but she knew she could not refuse this invitation. The coordinates led her to a mountain facility hidden beneath rock and snow and ice. A human woman in simple gray clothing met her at the entrance and guided her through tunnels carved deep into the Jewish earth. They walked for nearly an hour, passing through security checkpoints and sealed doors and chambers filled with equipment Keth did not recognize. Finally, they emerged into a vast underground cavern that took her breath away. The space was enormous, larger than any structure Keth had ever seen. It stretched for kilometers in every direction, and every centimeter of it was filled with something precious seeds, billions of them stored in crystalline containers that glowed with soft light. Animals preserved in stasis chambers, plants growing in climate-controlled enclosures, and, at the center of it all, enormous crystalline databases humming with stored information. Welcome to the Archive, Ambassador, said a voice behind her. Keth turned and found Counselor Okonkwo standing at her side with Elena Vasquez beside him. What is this place? Keth whispered. This is the quiet work. Elena said, This is what humanity has been doing for 300 years. She gestured to the rows of containers stretching into the distance. We have collected genetic samples from over 6,000 species in the Concord, she said. Plants and animals and microorganisms from worlds across the galaxy. Everything needed to rebuild ecosystems that have been destroyed. And here, Counselor Okonkwo said, leading Keth to the crystalline databases, we have preserved the cultural heritage of every civilization we could reach. Their art and music and literature, their scientific knowledge and philosophical wisdom, their languages and customs and beliefs. Keth stared at the databases and felt her heart beating faster. You have been watching us, she said, all this time. You have been watching and recording and preserving. We have been preparing. Elena said, not for war, but for what comes after. Keth turned to face them both. I do not understand, she said. What do you mean after? Counselor Okonkwo guided her to a quiet alcove where chairs had been arranged around a small table. We have studied history, Ambassador, he said. Not just our own history, but the history of your Concord and the empires that came before it. We have mapped the rise and fall of civilizations going back millions of years. He paused and his eyes were ancient and sad. Every empire falls, Ambassador, he said. Every conqueror is eventually conquered. The Vorath will defeat the Concord, or the Concord will defeat the Vorath. But either way, the winner will eventually collapse. That is the pattern, and it has never been broken. The Concord has existed for 12,000 years. Keth protested. We are not going to collapse. Counselor Okonkwo smiled gently. The Silurian collective has existed for 12,000 years, he said. But the Concord has only been stable for half that time. Before that, there were 3 great wars that nearly destroyed it. And before the Concord, there was the Athenian Empire, which lasted for 60,000 years before it crumbled into dust. Keth opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. He was right. She knew the history, she had simply never thought about what it meant. Elena leaned forward and took Keth's hand. We cannot stop the cycle, Ambassador, she said. We have accepted that. But we can preserve what would otherwise be lost. We can keep the seeds alive so that new gardens can grow. We can save the songs so that new voices can sing them. But that is not all, is it? Keth said slowly. You are preparing for something else. Counselor Okonkwo nodded. We call it the welcome, he said. When the cycle ends and new civilizations begin to rise, we will be here to help them. Not to conquer or control, but to teach and support and guide. We will share what we have preserved and help them build something better than what came before. Keth sat in silence for a long time, processing what she had learned. All those centuries, she had thought humanity was hiding from the galaxy. She had thought they were cowards or fools or simply indifferent to the suffering of others. But they had been working quietly and patiently and without any hope of recognition or reward. They had been preparing for a future that might not arrive for thousands of years. Why are you showing me this? She finally asked. Because we want you to understand, Elena said. We want you to know that our silence is not cruelty. We feel every death in this war, Ambassador. We grieve for every species that is lost, but we cannot save them by becoming part of the cycle that destroys them. Counselor Okonkwo stood and walked to a window that looked out over the vast archive. There is another reason, he said. The Vorath are pushing deeper into Concord space. Soon they will reach worlds with civilian populations who cannot evacuate in time. When that happens, those people will need somewhere to go. He turned to face Keth. We are opening our borders, Ambassador, he said. Not to soldiers, but to refugees. Anyone who needs sanctuary will find it here. We cannot fight your war, but we can protect those who can no longer protect themselves. Keth felt tears forming in her eyes, though she did not know why. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you. Counselor Okonkwo shook his head. Do not thank us, Ambassador, he said. We are only doing what we should have done from the beginning. We should have opened our hearts sooner. He smiled a sad smile. Perhaps that is the one thing about humanity that will never change. We always wait too long to do the right thing. Keth left the archive that afternoon, carrying a weight of knowledge she had not expected. She understood now why humanity remained quiet. They were not hiding from the galaxy. They were waiting for it. Waiting for the cycle to end, waiting for the chance to help it begin again. And in the meantime, they were saving everything they could so that nothing would be lost forever. It was not the answer she had wanted, but if they... Perhaps it was the answer the galaxy needed. The first refugee ships arrived 3 weeks after Keth returned to Concord space. They came in waves. Battered vessels carrying families who had lost everything. Children who had watched their homeworlds burn. Elders who remembered peace and wondered if they would ever see it again. The Vorath had accelerated their campaign with brutal efficiency. 4 more systems had fallen in a single month, and the Concord fleet was in full retreat. There was nowhere safe left to run except to the one place no one had ever expected to offer. Sanctuary Earth. Keth watched from her diplomatic vessel as the refugee convoy crossed into human space. She had helped coordinate the evacuation herself, traveling from system to system and gathering survivors. While Vorath warships closed in behind them, 17,000 souls on 42 ships, the largest migration to Earth in 300 years of Contact and humanity welcomed them without hesitation. The human ships that came to meet the convoy were not warships, but transports and medical vessels. They brought food and medicine and blankets and toys for the children. They brought translators who could speak a dozen alien languages and counselors who had trained for years to help trauma survivors heal. They brought hope. Kath followed the convoy to Earth and watched as the refugees were processed through welcome centers that seemed to have appeared overnight. The humans had prepared for this moment. They had built housing in schools and medical facilities. They had trained volunteers to work with each species that might arrive. They had thought of everything. How did you do this so quickly? Kath asked Elena as they walked through one of the new refugee settlements. Anna smiled and shook her head. We did not do it quickly, she said. We have been preparing for this for a century. We knew this day would come eventually. We just did not know. When Kath watched a human volunteer teaching a group of Theshan children how to play a simple game with a ball, the children were laughing. She had not heard a Theshan child laugh since their homeworld was destroyed. You truly do care, Kath said softly. Elena stopped walking and turned to face her. Of course we care, Ambassador, she said. Did you think our silence meant we did not feel? Kath shook her head slowly. I did not know what to think, she said. For 40 years, I have been trying to understand you, and I always failed. You seem so distant, so unconcerned. I thought perhaps you simply did not have the capacity to feel what we feel. Elena reached out and took Kath's hand. We feel everything, Ambassador, she said. Every death in this war hurts us. Every child orphaned, every culture destroyed. We feel it all. But we learned long ago that feeling is not the same as acting. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is wait. They walked in silence for a while past homes filled with refugees and gardens being planted by human and alien hands working together. Then the alarms began. Kath knew that sound. She had heard it too many times in the past year. Warships, the Dominion, had followed the refugees. A human officer appeared beside them, her face calm, but her eyes sharp. Ambassador Vasquez, Director, she said. We have detected a Varath fleet at the boundary of our system. 12 warships. They are demanding we surrender the refugees. Elena's expression did not change. What is the Council's response? She asked. The officer smiled a small, tight smile. The Council has already responded, Director, she said. We sent them a single word, and the word Elena asked. The officer's smile widened slightly. No, she said. Kath felt her blood run cold. You cannot fight the Varath, she said. You have no military. You have spent 300 years refusing to build weapons. They will destroy you. Elena squeezed her hand gently. We have spent 300 years refusing to use weapons, Ambassador, she said. That is not the same as refusing to build them before. Kath could respond. The sky above them flickered with light. She looked up and saw 3 Varath warships descending through the atmosphere. They were massive vessels bristling with weapons and armor designed to withstand anything the Concord could throw at them. And then they were gone. No explosion, no debris, no warning. One moment the ships were there, and the next they simply ceased to exist. Kath stared at the empty sky, her heart pounding. What happened? She whispered. Elena's expression was sad. We happened, Ambassador, she said. We warned them. They did not listen. The human officer touched her earpiece and nodded. The Varath fleet commander is requesting communication, she said. He sounds frightened. Elena nodded. Put him through to the Council, she said. Perhaps now he will be willing to talk. That night, Kath sat with Counselor Okonkwo in his private office and demanded answers. What did you do to those ships? She asked. Counselor Okonkwo poured her a cup of tea and sat down across from her. We removed them, he said simply. How? Kath demanded. The counselor sipped his tea and was silent for a long moment. When humanity chose peace 300 years ago, We did not become naive, Ambassador. He said, we knew the galaxy was dangerous. We knew that someday someone would come to our door with hostile intent. So we prepared. He set down his cup and met her eyes. We spent 3 centuries developing technologies we hoped we would never need. Weapons that could end a war before it began. Defenses that no fleet could penetrate. We built them and we hid them and we prayed we would never have to use them, and now you have used them. Keth said. Counselor Okonkwo nodded slowly. 3 ships, he said. 3 ships to make a point. We told the Varath commander that we have no interest in war. We told him that if he withdraws his fleet and leaves this system in peace, we will never speak of this again. But if he returns with hostile intent, we will remove his entire fleet, the same way we removed those 3 ships. What did he say? Keth asked. The counselor smiled a tired smile. He is withdrawing. He said, the Varath are many things, Ambassador, but they are not stupid. They know when they have found something they cannot defeat. Keth sat in silence, processing everything she had. Learned you could have ended this war at any time. She finally said, you had the power to stop the Varath before they destroyed a single world. Counselor Okonkwo nodded yes. He said, we could have then. Why? Keth demanded. Why did you let so many die? The counselor leaned forward, and his eyes were filled with ancient sorrow. Because if we had used our weapons to conquer the Varath, we would have become the Varath. He said, we would have entered the cycle that we spent 300 years escaping. Today we used our power to protect, not to conquer. We made clear that we will defend our home and those who seek shelter here, but we will not attack first. We will not expand. We will not rule. He sat back and spread his hands. That is the only way to break the cycle, Ambassador. Refuse to be part of it. Even when it hurts, even when it would be easier to strike first. The only way to build something new is to let the old way die on its own. Keth left Earth the next morning, carrying a message for the Concord. The Varath had withdrawn from human space, and they would not return. The refugees were safe, and somewhere in the silent reaches of a single unremarkable star system, species that had once nearly destroyed itself was proving that another way was possible, one patient century at a time. The war continued for another decade. The Varath pushed deeper into Concord space, and the Concord pushed back, and billions of lives were lost on both sides. But something had changed. Word of what happened in human space spread through the galaxy like fire through dry grass. The Varath had been stopped, not defeated in battle, but simply stopped. 3 of their mightiest warships had been erased from existence without a shot being fired, and humanity had not pursued them, had not demanded tribute or surrender, had simply asked them to leave and then return to their gardens and their children and their quiet, patient lives. Keth spent those years traveling between Concord systems, carrying refugees to Earth and carrying stories back to the Concord. She told anyone who would listen about what she had seen. The archives filled with seeds and songs, the welcome centers prepared for civilizations yet to be born, the terrible gentle power that humanity kept hidden and refused to use for conquest at first. No one believed her. The galaxy had never seen a species choose restraint over dominance. It seemed impossible and natural, but the refugees kept coming, and they kept telling the same stories. Stories of humans who welcomed strangers without asking what they could offer in return, stories of volunteers who learned alien languages and alien customs just so they could help refugees feel at home, stories of children playing together in parks filled with flowers from 100 different worlds. Slowly, the galaxy began to listen. The Varath were the first to change, not all at once, but gradually. Some of their commanders began questioning the endless expansion. Some of their soldiers began wondering what they were fighting for. Some of their leaders began asking whether there might be another way. The war did not end cleanly. Wound down over years as both sides grew tired and poor and desperate for something different. Final treaty was signed on a neutral station at the edge of Concord. Space, and the terms were harsh but fair, and when it was over, the galaxy found itself in a strange new position for the first time in 12,000 years. There was no great enemy to fight, no existential threat to unite against, just a vast collection of wounded species trying to figure out what peace actually looked like. That was when the delegation started arriving at Earth, not refugees this time, but ambassadors. They came from every corner of the Concord, and even from the Vorath Dominion. They came with questions that had never been asked before. How did you build a society without war? How did you heal from violence that nearly destroyed you? How did you learn to be patient when patience seemed like surrender? Keth was there when the first Vorath delegation landed on Earth. She watched their commander, a massive scarred warrior named Tharak, step onto human soil and look around with confusion in his ancient eyes. "It is so quiet here," Tharak said. "How can it be so quiet?" Keth smiled and touched his arm gently. "That is what peace sounds like, Commander," she said. "You will get used to it." She introduced him to Elena, who had become one of the primary liaisons between humanity and the galaxy. Elena greeted the Vorath commander with the same warmth she showed everyone and invited him to walk with her through the gardens. Keth watched them go and felt something she had not felt in decades. Hope Elena and Keth met one final time on a hill overlooking the city where Keth had spent so many frustrated nights 40 years before. The sun was setting, and the sky was painted in shades of orange and purple and gold. "You could have ended this war before it started," Keth said. "You had the power all along." Elena nodded slowly. "Yes," she said. We could have destroyed the Vorath fleet in a single day and declared ourselves masters of the galaxy." "Then why did you not?" Keth asked. Elena turned to look at her, and her eyes were filled with something Keth had come to recognize over the years. Not wisdom exactly, not arrogance, something deeper, something that had been paid for in blood and suffering and centuries of patient waiting, because that is how it always works, Ambassador. Elena said, "The conquering species becomes the conquered species. The liberator becomes the tyrant. The cycle never ends, it just changes names." She looked out over the city, where lights were beginning to flicker on in windows. "We wanted to break the cycle," she said, "not by conquering it, but by refusing to participate. We knew it would take generations. We knew we would have to watch civilizations burn while we stood by and did nothing. But we also knew that the only way to teach peace was to live." Keth was silent for a long time, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. "Did you ever doubt?" she finally asked. "Did you ever wonder if you were wrong every day?" Elena said. "Every time we heard about another world destroyed, every time refugees arrived with stories of horror we could have prevented, we doubted, we questioned, we argued. Among ourselves," she smiled, a sad, gentle smile. "But we also remembered what we were before," she said. "We remembered the wars we fought and the atrocities we committed and the extinction we nearly brought upon ourselves. And we knew that if we gave in to the temptation to use our power, we would become that thing again. So you waited." Keth said. "We waited," Elena agreed. "And now maybe we do not have to wait anymore." She gestured to the city below, where the lights of 1,000 homes glowed warm against the gathering darkness. "They are learning, Ambassador," she said. "All of them. The Concord and the Vorath and everyone else. They're starting to ask different questions. Not how do we win, but how do we build? Not how do we conquer, but how do we heal? It will take time." Keth said. Elena laughed softly. "We have time," she said. "That is the one thing humanity has always had. Patience." They sat together on the hill as night fell over the city, and the stars emerged in their millions. Somewhere out there civilizations were rebuilding. Somewhere species that had been enemies for generations were learning to be neighbors. Somewhere the cycle that had ground the galaxy down for millions of years was finally beginning to slow, and on a small blue planet orbiting an unremarkable yellow star, a species that had once nearly destroyed itself was tending its gardens and raising its children and watching the stars. With quiet, patient hope, not because they did not care, but because they had learned that caring meant something different than the galaxy had always believed. It meant waiting, it meant preserving, it meant being ready to help when the time was finally right. The stars burned cold and ancient above them. Empires had risen and fallen beneath their light for millions of years. But tonight, something was different tonight. The galaxy was quiet, and humanity smiled and returned to their gardens, knowing that their long, patient work had only just begun.